Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about Ulpian Fulwell's play, Like Will to Like. So Fulwell, first off, you don't meet many Ulpians these days. That's a name. I think Ulpian Fulwell would be a great name for a cat. But Fulwell was sort of on that cusp of the transition from late medieval to early modern England. He lived from 1545 to 1584 or 86. Apparently that's unclear exactly when he died, which is in itself kind of interesting, because usually with these kinds of things, what you have is an uncertain birth date. But then by the time someone who makes it into, say, an anthology of literature, by the time they die, they tend to become sort of well enough known that people take note of when they die. So usually it's the other way around. But so he lived 1545 to 1584 or 86. So he lived during the reign of the Tudors. With much of his life being during his adult life, certainly being during the reign of Elizabeth I. And so the Tudors are definitely so one sort of rough metric that people use to mark the transition from the medieval period to the early modern period in English history is the 1480s, because two major things happen. One, politically, is that the Battle of Bosworth Field occurs. Richard III is killed by Henry Tudor, who becomes Henry VII, founding the Tudor dynasty. And so this is sometimes seen politically as the foundations of the early modern period or the Renaissance in England. The other cultural thing that happens is that William Caxton brings the printing press to England. He invents the English printing press, even though it had already been invented by Johannes Gutenberg in Germany, and it had been invented by the Chinese well before Gutenberg invented his. But this allowed the mass printing of works in a way that had never been possible before, right? Any piece of literature or anything, religious pamphlets, political tracts, all had to be written out by hand, which made mass distribution very, very labor intensive. Whereas when you have a printing press and you can just press copy after copy after copy, it's much, much easier to distribute. And so the value of literacy goes up, which contributes to an expansion of knowledge, right? So Fulwell is in the early modern period, but he's early enough in the early modern period that we're still getting a lot of very, very strong medieval influences. And that's central to Like Will to Like, which is a proverb play, which I actually think this might be the first proverb play I've ever read. It's a subset of Allegory, as I understand it. And I mean, it's clear if we look just at the characters list that this is allegorical, right? So we have characters like Nicol Newfangle, Tom Collier, Tom Tosspot, Rafe Royster, Philip Fleming, who's supposed to be a Fleming, or Fleming-like. He has the characteristics of a Fleming, which basically was like, in the sort of medieval and early modern English imagination, people from Flanders, people from what are today the Low Countries, the Netherlands, Belgium, these places, were generally regarded as sort of drunk, gluttonous. They loved butter, this sort of stuff, right? Cuthbert Cutpurse, Pierce Pickpurse, virtuous living, good fame, God's promise, honor, severity, and Hankin Hangman. So the names here, especially in the latter portion of this, for the good characters, right? Virtuous living, good fame, God's promise, honor, and severity. These are either Victorian sort of Puritans' names, or these are clearly allegory. And in this case, they are clearly allegory, right? Like, virtuous living, that character exists to be like, you should be living a godly life. Stop doing your bad stuff, other characters. So, I mean, again, there's clearly this moral component to the allegory, as you see in medieval drama all the time. Plays like Everyman, Mankind, things like this. These very directly allegorical works. Fulwell is working in that tradition, even though it's getting quite late for that, right? Because as we move into the early modern period and start getting to playwrights like Thomas Kyd, like Christopher Marlowe, like Shakespeare, like John Ford, these kinds of people, Ben Jonson, etc., they're developing much more sophisticated and complex storylines that go well beyond what allegory is generally capable of. But this is, again, a subspecies of allegory. It's a proverb play, and the proverb that is at the core of this play is the titular proverb, that like will to like, or the sort of full title would be something like will to like, quote the devil to the collier. And basically, the entire thrust of the play is morally bad people and entities like the devil, who does show up in the play a couple of times, will sort of flock together and they will enhance one another's badness. Whereas morally good people and entities will group together and they will go and become more virtuous, right? So things that are similar to one another will group themselves together and they will diverge further. And we get this very clearly and directly. And then we get it clearly and directly again. And again, and again, and again, and again, and again. So this play, in total, let me just double check this here. So in total, this play is about 1,277 lines. I would say about 2,000 of those are probably characters saying, like will to like, because they literally just repeat it over and over and over again. Like, it's impossible to watch this play or read this play and not be like, I guess the objective of this, I guess the lesson that I'm supposed to learn is that bad characters will group together, good characters will group together. Like, you could not get away from it. It is 1,000% unsubtle. And so this starts from the preface, I guess. This sort of inscription or something. It wouldn't, I think, be part of the performance, but it seems to be part of the manuscript, probably. So it says here, an interlude entitled, Like will to like, quoth the devil to the collier, very godly and full of pleasant mirth, wherein is declared not only what punishment followeth those that will rather follow licentious living than to esteem and follow good counsel, and what great benefits and commodities they receive that apply them unto virtuous living and good exercises, made by Ulpian Fulwell. So the sort of preface tells us, this is what the moral is, you're going to see it. Then we get the prologue, which would actually be performed. And I'm not going to read you the whole thing because it's 36 lines long in early modern English, so it's quite lengthy, but I'll read you the first little bit of it. Cicero in his book De Amicite these words doth express, saying nothing is more desirous than like is unto like, whose words are more true and of a certain doubtless, for the virtue Virtuous do not the virtuous company mislike, but the vicious do the virtuous company eschew, and like will unto like. This is most true. It is not my meaning your ears to weary with hearkening what is the effect of our matter, but our pretense is to move you to be merry, merrily to speak, meaning no man to flatter. The name of this matter, as I said, while ere is like will to like, quoth the devil to the collier. Such prithee proverbs in our English tongue doth abound. Our author thought good such a one for to choose, as may show good example and mirth may be found, but no lascivious toys he purposeth for to use. Herein, as it were in a glass, see you may the advancement of virtue, of vice the decay. So there's a few more stanzas after that, but you get the gist of it, right? This is a prologue that directly tells you, hey, this is a proverb play. This is the proverb. It comes from Cicero, but it's a good Christian lesson. You're going to get some sermonizing about how you should be virtuous, etc., etc. And indeed, we do get some sermonizing when virtuous living shows up. So virtuous living shows up a decent ways in. I'd say about halfway into the play, and the first thing that he says when he comes on stage is, O gracious God, how wonderful are thy works, how highly art thou of all men to be praised, of Christians, Saracens, Jews, and also Turks, thy glory ought to be erected and raised. And he goes on for another 15 or so lines, basically just being like, hey, God's so awesome. Everybody should be in love with God. And then some stuff happens. He has some interactions with Nicol Newfangle, during which they point out that this is an allegory, because Nicol Newfangle at some point... So basically, Nicol Newfangle is like, hey, you, dude, I think I might know you. And Virtuous Living's like, well, I don't recognize you, but if you tell me your name, maybe I can remember if we met. And then Nicol Newfangle says, but indeed I was but little... He says or pretends that he can't remember his name. And he says, but indeed I was but little when I was first born, and my mother, to tell me my name, thought it scorn. And Virtuous Living says, I will never acquaint me with such in any place as are ashamed of their names by God's grace. And then after Nicol Newfangle tells Virtuous Living his name, Virtuous Living says, and my conditions and thine so far do disagree, that no familiarity between us may be, for thou nourisheth vice both day and night. My name is Virtuous Living, and in virtue is my delight, so vice and virtue cannot together be united. So Nicol Newfangle definitely is a villainous character, and the nature of his villainy is interesting. So there's an editorial note here from Christina M. Fitzgerald and John T. Sebastian, who are the editors of this Broadview anthology of medieval drama, out of which I'm reading this, which says of the name Newfangle, to be newfangled is to be overly interested in new things, and often only new things, or to be excessively trendy and fashionable, hence the reference in the speech below to gowns with long sleeves and wings, intricate ruffs, and other fashionable Elizabethan clothing. For moralists in this period, fashionable clothing, especially clothing made with excessive amounts of material, was seen as prideful and wasteful, and immoderate attention to new things at the expense of the old and the established was morally suspect behavior. So, what we learn about Nicol Newfangle, immediately when he comes in, he sort of introduces himself, and he tells us all about himself. And he's basically like, yeah, when I was a baby, I was taken to hell, and I became the godson of the devil, And the devil sent me back to Earth basically to be like, here's a bunch of fancy clothes and shit. And people would be like, oh man, those are some fancy clothes. I really want those fancy clothes because I am giving in to the sin of pride and I'm going to waste and be excessive and immoral and decadent. And God doesn't like that, but the devil does. So this is Nicol Newfangle's whole scheme. And it seems to be remarkably effective as far as we can tell, because the first half of the play is basically just him meeting a whole bunch of villainous characters, like Tom Collier. So the devil does show up. And actually, Nicol Newfangle seems to have a very strange relationship with the devil, because on the one hand, he's doing the devil's bidding, but the devil's always like, hey man, do this thing for me. And Nicol Newfangle's like, I'd prefer not to. I don't really like you, the devil. But he's like really taken the initiative in terms of doing the stuff that the devil wants done. So it's a very strange relationship. And actually, when the devil enters, Nicol Newfangle says, Sancte benedicite, which would basically be, bless you, Holy One, something like that, in Latin. And it would have been like to address the devil with Latin terms of adoration for an audience. It'd be an interesting thing in this period, right? Because if you had gone back 100 years prior to, if you'd gone back 100 years prior to Henry VIII's break with Rome, establishment of the Anglican Church, and the dissolution of the monasteries, and if you'd put this in a properly medieval play, where the theology is definitely Catholic, medieval Catholicism, this would be quite a sacrilegious thing. But strangely enough, medieval people really liked that. And I think it's a very weird thing, right? In some ways, the Puritanism of the Protestant Reformation, or founded in the Protestant Reformation, and then that sort of has marked American culture as my own cultural context, I think in some ways has really kind of been detrimental to the sort of possibilities of religious joy that the medieval people found. And we see this as well in Like Will to Like, this sort of strange blending of the religious and the sacrilegious. And I don't know, in a strange way, there's almost a sort of Milton's Satan type vibe to this, in that the good characters in this play are rather boring, right? Like Virtuous Living shows up and he just sermonizes for a while, but like Nicol Newfangle and his crew of various villains, they're clearly bad characters because they're drunks, they're getting into fights, they're stealing stuff. But there's also this sort of hail fellow, well met type bonhomie to them, right? There's this sort of like joy of the comic villain to them in a way that we don't get with the virtuous characters. And there's this very much grotesque element to the play, which again is completely foreign to a modern audience, right? We think of the sacred as the sacred and the profane as the profane, and never the twain shall meet. But the medieval mind did not have that distinction, and Fulwell in this early portion of the early modern period clearly did not have that distinction, because we have a character named Tom Collier who enters, and he is a sort of disciple of the devil. It's hard for me to exactly navigate what his relationship with the devil is, except that he is also sort of working for the devil. And he meets up with Nicol Newfangle, and they have this chat. And interestingly enough, Tom Collier is... So what it says here in the note is that his speech is an attempt to represent the rural accent of the Cotswold region of southwest England, an accent traditionally associated with rusticity and comedy. So it is a weirdly written sort of local color thing, but Fulwell himself was from Somerset, which is in the southwest, right? So he probably grew up with people who had West Country accents, right? And how much accents definitely change over time. There is significant evidence, I believe, that the early modern English accent sounded more like a modern West Country accent than it did like, say, modern received pronunciation, like the royal family speaks or whatever it is. But anyway, put that aside, right? So Tom Collier comes in and he speaks, again, with this very sort of West Country accent, which I will do badly. So his first thing that he says is, "By mass, God a mercy, my friend Nicol." And Nicol says, "By God and welcome, gentle Tom Lickhole." And this is a sort of strange thing that gets picked up, because his name is Tom Collier, but Nicol Newfangle sort of insults him in this way. And Nicol Newfangle has this thing where people will call him Nicol, which is his name, and then he'll be like, "and nothing else but even plain Nicol." So, and this has to do with his sort of whole newfangled thing, right? He doesn't want to just have his name be plain and unadorned. So he says, "and nothing else but even plain Nicol." And Tom Collier says, "I pray thee..." I'm not going to do the West Country accent anymore, because I'm not good at it. "I pray thee tell me how dost, good friend Lickhole." So he sort of turns the insult back on Nicol Newfangle. Nicol says, "It is turned from Nicol to Lickhole with Tom Collier. I say no more, Tom, but hold thy nose there." And he gestures to his ass. And Tom Collier says, "Nay, hold thy tongue, Nicol, till my nose doth come, so thou shalt take part, and I shall take some." And I don't really understand why we're getting so much discourse about licking one another's asses, but it shows up over and over and over in the play. The villainous characters are constantly talking about either licking one another's or licking the devil's ass, or they're talking about soiling their pants, or saying you smell like you soiled your pants, all this stuff, right? There's so much scatological humor in this. And again, I think that's one of this very odd things, because if we sort of think about this rhetorically, if we think about this in terms of ethos building, one of the elements of ethos, which deals with your credibility, reliability, trustworthiness for an audience, one of the things about ethos is that it includes humor. It includes sort of seeming relatable in some way, right? Not that I think that sort of early modern people were necessarily going around and eating ass and shitting their pants and whatever it was, but these are forms of humor that I think would be uproariously funny to early modern people. And so the fact that the villainous characters are the ones who constantly get the jokes, basically, right? They get the kind of slapstick, grotesque jokes. And I think that's very interesting because, again, it's a bit like Milton's Paradise Lost, in which Satan is such an interesting character that even though he's clearly the villain for Milton, God and Adam are so fucking boring that it's hard to really get revved up about them, right? It's hard to get excited about Team God and Adam because they're just so bland, whereas Satan is interesting. We have the same kind of thing here, and it's a very strange element of allegory plays, morality plays, all of this kind of stuff, because the characters who are the funniest and the most humorously effective are often the villains, but they're likely the characters that people are going to remember because they're funny.